May 15th, 1817. The Westbrook Ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns in shades of ivory and rose, across jewels that caught the brilliance and threw it back in rainbow fragments. The orchestra played a lively country dance, and the floor swirled with motion, with youth, with laughter that rang bright as crystal against marble floors. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of it all, as she had stood for 11 seasons, her position as fixed and unremarkable as the potted palms that lined the perimeter. She wore a gown of blue silk that had been fashionable 3 years prior, altered twice to accommodate changing styles, the colour still fine, but the cut betraying its age to any discerning eye. At 29, Eleanor had learned to make herself small, to occupy the spaces between notice, to expect nothing beyond the thin courtesy society afforded spinsters who had long since ceased to matter. Her face, though not unpleasant, bore the unmistakable mark of resignation, a certain stillness in her expression that came from years of being looked through rather than at. Her brown hair, dressed simply, framed features that might have been called handsome in a kinder world. But handsomeness was not what the marriage mart valued. Youth, vivacity, a certain decorative charm, these were the currencies that purchased regard, and Eleanor's purse had been empty for years. She watched her younger sister Margaret's friends whirl past in the arms of eligible gentlemen, girls who had been children when Eleanor first entered society, now wives themselves, some already mothers. The sight no longer pained her as it once had. She had made peace with invisibility, or so she told herself in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. The sudden stir near the entrance drew every eye, and Eleanor felt the shift in the room's attention like a change in air pressure before a storm. The Duke of Pembroke had arrived. Eleanor had heard the whispers, as everyone had. He had inherited the title 6 months prior upon his elder brother's unexpected death, called back from diplomatic service abroad to assume responsibilities he had never expected to bear. He was 35, unwed, and possessed of a fortune that made even the wealthiest families recalculate their daughters' prospects. The crowd parted for him, as water parts for a ship's prow, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of dark hair, broad shoulders clothed in evening black of such perfect tailoring, it could only have come from Weston, a face that carried both weariness and something else, something watchful and measuring. His gaze swept the ballroom with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading rooms, to assessing what lay beneath surface pleasantries, and then, impossibly, his eyes found hers. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps less, but Eleanor felt it like a physical touch, a jolt of recognition that made no sense because they had never met, because men like him did not see women like her. Before she could make sense of it, he was surrounded by society matrons, presenting daughters like offerings at an altar, and the moment, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Eleanor turned and slipped through the doorway that led to the library. Seeking refuge in the only place she had ever truly belonged, her heart beating with a confusion she could not name and dared not examine. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The library smelled of leather and beeswax, of aging paper and the faint ghost of pipe smoke from some previous occupant. And Eleanor breathed it in like medicine, letting the familiar comfort settle her rattled nerves. The sounds of the ball reached her only faintly here, muffled by thick walls and heavy doors, the music reduced to a ghostly pulse that seemed to come from another world entirely. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she had examined at a dozen such gatherings, seeking refuge in the same rooms because the library was always safe, always empty, always willing to shelter those who did not belong among the glittering crowd. She pulled a volume from the shelf without looking at the title, needing only the weight of it in her hands, the solid reality of something that would not judge or dismiss her. And when she finally focused on the cover, she felt a small shock of recognition. Italian architecture of the Renaissance, the gilt letters proclaimed, and she opened it to find detailed engravings of buildings she had only dreamed of seeing, structures of such perfect proportion and beauty that her throat tightened with longing for a life that extended beyond London ballrooms and pitying glances. She was so absorbed in a drawing of a Florentine palazzo that she did not hear the door open, did not sense another presence until a voice spoke from behind her, low and measured and unmistakably masculine. "I wondered where you had gone," the voice said, and Eleanor turned so quickly she nearly dropped the book, her heart leaping into her throat as she found herself facing the Duke of Pembroke alone, in a room where no chaperone would think to follow, because no one imagined a duke would pursue a spinster into the shadows. "Your Grace," she managed, executing a curtsy that felt clumsy under his steady gaze. "I apologize. I did not mean to intrude. I shall return to the ballroom." He raised one hand in a gesture that was both graceful and commanding. "Please do not," he said, his eyes moving to the book she clutched like a shield. "I came seeking escape from the chaos as well, though I confess I also came seeking you. We were not properly introduced, and I find myself curious about the one woman in that ballroom who looked as though she wished to be anywhere else." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain whether his words were kindness or subtle mockery. "I am Miss Eleanor Ashworth, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice level through years of practice at maintaining dignity in uncomfortable moments. "Forgive me, I did not realize my feelings were so transparent." He moved closer, close enough that she could see his eyes were not merely dark, but a deep grey, like winter skies before snow. "Alexander Pembroke," he said, as though his title were an afterthought. "And transparency is not a fault, Miss Ashworth. It is a rarity. Most faces in that ballroom are masks worn so long their owners have forgotten what lies beneath. Tell me, what draws you to Italian architecture?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely interested in its delivery, that Eleanor found herself answering honestly instead of deflecting with the self-deprecating humor she had learned to employ. "The harmony of it," she said quietly, "the way proportion and beauty serve purpose rather than vanity, the sense that something can be both functional and transcendent. I have studied it for years through books, though I do not suppose I shall ever see the buildings themselves." "Why not?" he asked, and the question hung between them like a challenge until the door burst open and Lady Catherine Rushworth swept in, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with predatory interest. "Your Grace, there you are," she declared, her voice bright with false warmth. "We have all been searching for you. And here you are, tucked away with dear Eleanor. How amusing." Eleanor felt the moment shatter like dropped crystal, felt herself become invisible again as Lady Catherine positioned herself between them, chattering about the dancing and the supper and all the young ladies waiting hopefully for the Duke's attention, and when Eleanor slipped from the room, neither of them seemed to notice her departure, though she could have sworn she felt his eyes follow her into the corridor beyond. May 16th, 1817. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ashworth breakfast room, falling across the modest table where Eleanor sat with her mother and sister, the pale sunshine doing little to warm the chill she felt as she spread marmalade across toast she had no appetite to eat. Her mother, Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, presided over the teapot with the careful attention she gave to all matters of household management, her face already showing the pinched expression that preceded one of her headaches, those convenient ailments that appeared whenever life failed to meet her exacting expectations. Margaret sat across from Eleanor, her younger sister's face still soft with the contentment of 2 years of happy marriage, her condition not yet showing, but revealed in the careful way she declined the kippers and chose only dry toast. And Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of love and envy that had become her constant companion since Margaret had wed. "I saw you speaking with the Duke of Pembroke last evening," Margaret said gently, her eyes warm with genuine interest rather than the calculation that would have marked their mother's inquiry. "He seemed quite engaged in your conversation before Lady Catherine interrupted." Mrs. Ashworth set down the teapot with more force than necessary, the china rattling against the saucer. "Do not fill your sister's head with fancies, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of 11 seasons spent watching her eldest daughter fail to secure a match. His Grace was merely being polite, as any gentleman would be when trapped in a library with an unmarried lady. I am certain he thought nothing more of it. Eleanor felt the words land like stones in still water, the ripples of dismissal spreading through her chest, but she had learned long ago not to argue with her mother's assessments, had learned that defending herself only prolonged the discomfort, and confirmed her mother's belief that Eleanor held foolish hopes beyond her station. "It was nothing, Mamma," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on her toast. "We spoke briefly of architecture, nothing of consequence." Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Eleanor's hand, a gesture of solidarity that made Eleanor's throat tighten with gratitude. But before either could speak further, the sound of the door knocker echoed through the small house with unusual force for such an early hour. They heard Perkins, their aging butler, shuffle to answer it, heard the murmur of voices, and then the old servant appeared in the doorway, holding a silver salver with a single envelope upon it, the thick cream paper and crimson wax seal unmistakably those of an aristocratic house. "For Mrs. Ashworth and family," Perkins announced, his usually steady voice betraying a hint of excitement, delivered by the Duke of Pembroke's footman. "Mrs. Gore's." Ashworth's hand flew to her throat as she took the letter, breaking the seal with fingers that trembled slightly, her eyes scanning the contents with increasing speed before she looked up at Eleanor with an expression that mingled shock, calculation, and something that might have been hope. "We have been invited to a garden party at Pembroke House," she said slowly, as though testing the reality of the words. 4 days hence. The invitation specifically names all 3 of us." Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat faster, felt the dangerous flutter of possibility rising in her chest, despite every lesson experience had taught her about the folly of hope. Margaret smiled broadly, but Mrs. Ashworth's gaze had already fixed on Eleanor with new intensity, her eyes cataloguing every deficit with the ruthless efficiency of a general assessing troops before battle. "We must see about your wardrobe," she said briskly, the headache apparently forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. "That green muslin might do if we add new trim, and your hair must be properly dressed, none of this simple style you prefer. If His Grace has taken some notice of you, we cannot squander the opportunity through carelessness." Eleanor said nothing, merely nodded, but inside she felt the precarious balance between hope and self-protection tip dangerously toward the former, and she wondered whether the Duke of Pembroke had any idea what tempest his simple invitation had unleashed in the quiet disappointment of her life. May 20th, 1817. The afternoon sun cast golden light across the gardens of Pembroke House, transforming the assembled guests into figures from a painting, their pastel gowns and dark coats arranged artfully against the backdrop of manicured lawns and flowering hedges that spoke of wealth so established it need not announce itself. Eleanor stood in the receiving line with her mother and Margaret, her hands clasped tightly before her to still their trembling. The green muslin gown with its new trim suddenly feeling like a costume meant for someone else, someone younger and more hopeful than the woman who wore it. The Duke of Pembroke greeted each guest with perfect courtesy, his manner formal and distant, and when Eleanor's turn came, his eyes passed over her with the same polite acknowledgement he had given the dozen guests before her, no flicker of recognition warming his expression, no reference to their library conversation or the invitation that had so disrupted her carefully maintained equilibrium. "Miss Ashworth," he said, inclining his head with mechanical precision before turning to Margaret, and Eleanor felt the sharp sting of disappointment, even as she told herself she had been foolish to expect anything different, that whatever interest she imagined in the library had been nothing more than a duke's practiced courtesy to a wallflower he found in his path. She moved with her family into the gardens, where tables laden with refreshments stood beneath striped awnings, where other guests clustered in groups that shifted and reformed like patterns in a kaleidoscope. And she accepted a glass of lemonade from a footman while her mother assessed the gathering with calculating eyes, and Margaret squeezed her arm in silent sympathy. A gentleman appeared at the Duke's side, tall and fair where Alexander was dark, his expression open and friendly, in a way that suggested he found genuine pleasure in social gatherings, rather than viewing them as duty. And Eleanor heard someone nearby identify him as Lord Richard Sinclair, the Duke's closest friend since their school days. She drifted away from her mother's increasingly anxious supervision, seeking refuge in the parts of the garden where fewer guests congregated, and found herself drawn to a rose garden enclosed by high hedges, the blooms still early in their season, but promising spectacular beauty in the weeks to come. She was examining a particularly lovely pale pink specimen when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find the Duke approaching, his expression transformed from the formal mask he had worn in the receiving line, something intent and focused in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried the same warmth it had held in the library. "I apologize for my earlier coldness. There are reasons I cannot yet explain for maintaining certain appearances in public, but I hoped we might continue our conversation about Italian architecture, perhaps discuss Palladio's influence on English design," and Eleanor felt her confusion deepen even as her traitorous heart lifted at his attention. But before she could respond, the sound of other guests approaching made his expression shudder once more, the warmth draining from his manner as he stepped back and offered her a formal bow before turning to greet Lady Catherine Rushworth and her companions, leaving Eleanor standing alone among the roses, wondering whether she had imagined the entire exchange or whether she was caught in some game whose rules she could not begin to understand. May 21st, 1817. The morning air in Hyde Park carried the scent of early blooming flowers and freshly scythed grass, and Eleanor walked beside Margaret along the serpentine path that curved between towering elms, their branches creating patterns of shadow and light that shifted with each breath of wind, though Eleanor noticed none of the beauty around her. Her mind still trapped in the confusion of the previous afternoon's garden party and the Duke of Pembroke's inexplicable behavior that had left her feeling as though she were trying to read a book with half its pages torn away. Margaret had suggested the walk with gentle insistence, her sister's perceptive eyes having noted Eleanor's distraction at breakfast and the way she had pushed food around her plate without eating, and Eleanor was grateful for the companionship even if she could not bring herself to speak of the turmoil in her heart, the dangerous hope that kept trying to take root despite the stony ground of her experience. They had just rounded a bend near a small grove of ornamental shrubs when Eleanor heard voices ahead, the distinctive sharp tone of Lady Catherine Rushworth cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. And Eleanor's steps faltered as she recognized that her former friend was holding court with 3 other ladies on a bench just beyond the shrubs, close enough that their voices carried clearly but far enough that they had not yet noticed Eleanor's approach. "Poor Miss Ashworth," Lady Catherine was saying, her voice dripping with false sympathy that barely masked the cruelty beneath. "I fear she has quite mistaken His Grace's politeness for something more significant. You should have seen her face in the rose garden yesterday, positively glowing with hope. It was almost painful to witness. A woman of her age should know better than to fancy herself the object of a duke's serious attention." Another voice joined in with a tittering laugh, asking whether the duke was merely being charitable to a spinster whom everyone had long since dismissed, and Lady Catherine responded that she suspected exactly that, saying that His Grace was known for his kindness and had likely taken pity on poor Eleanor after seeing her standing alone at the Westbrook ball, that he probably felt obligated to show courtesy to a woman so thoroughly overlooked by society, but surely could have no genuine interest in a 29-year-old woman with no fortune, no beauty, and no prospects beyond becoming a burden to her married sister. Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one finding the tender places in her heart where doubt already lived. And she stood frozen on the path as Margaret's hand tightened on her arm in silent support and shared outrage. But before Eleanor could turn away, she heard Lady Catherine add in a voice of poisonous certainty that the Duke of Pembroke would soon tire of his charitable impulse, and Eleanor would be left more pitiable than before, having allowed herself to believe that she might escape the fate her advanced age and lack of attributes had sealed for her. Margaret pulled Eleanor firmly back the way they had come, steering her away from the venomous gathering, and Eleanor walked mechanically beside her sister, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall in public. The fragile hope she had carried from the rose garden now crushed beneath the weight of words that gave voice to every fear she had tried to suppress. May 25th, 1817. The evening musicale at Somerset House drew London society into its elegant drawing rooms, where gilt chairs had been arranged in careful rows facing the pianoforte, and Eleanor sat beside Margaret in the third row back, positioned where she could observe without being particularly noticed, a location she had occupied at countless such gatherings over the past 11 years, though tonight the familiar obscurity felt less like refuge and more like punishment after the confusing pain of the past 4 days. She had resolved during the sleepless hours following the encounter in Hyde Park to guard her heart more carefully, to recognize the Duke of Pembroke's attention for what Lady Catherine had named it, a charitable impulse from a man too well bred to openly ignore a wallflower he had inadvertently encouraged. And yet when he entered the drawing-room, her treacherous heart still leapt at the sight of him before she forced her gaze down to her hands folded tightly in her lap. The musicale proceeded with the usual offerings, young ladies performing pieces selected more for their brevity than their beauty, their anxious mothers watching from the sides with expressions that mingled hope and dread, and Eleanor felt a familiar mixture of sympathy and relief that her own performing days were long past, that no one expected her to display herself like goods at market anymore. When Lady Somerset approached her during the interval with an unusual request, Eleanor initially demurred, saying she had not played publicly in years, and surely there were younger ladies better suited to entertain the company. But their hostess insisted with surprising firmness that she had heard from Margaret about Eleanor's skill, and the program needed a more accomplished performer to close the evening. Eleanor felt rather than saw the Duke of Pembroke move to stand near the pianoforte as she took her seat before the instrument, her hands trembling slightly as they found the keys, and she chose a piece by Mozart that had always spoken to her of longing and loss, pouring into the music all the confused emotion of the past weeks, the hope she had tried to suppress, and the pain of believing herself foolish for entertaining it. The room fell genuinely quiet as she played, not the restless silence of polite endurance, but the stillness of authentic attention, and when the final notes faded, the applause that followed carried real warmth rather than mere obligation to She rose from the instrument with a curtsy, intending to return quickly to her seat and the safety of obscurity, but found the Duke of Pembroke at her elbow, his dark eyes intense in a way that made her breath catch, despite her resolutions. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone beneath the surrounding conversations. "Might I have a word with you in the music room? There is something I must say that cannot wait any longer." And though every instinct of self-preservation urged her to refuse, though Lady Catherine's cruel words still echoed in her memory, Eleanor found herself nodding and allowing him to guide her through a side door into the smaller chamber, where instruments were stored between performances. May 27th, 1817. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air between the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, and Eleanor stood before the architecture section, with Margaret browsing novels nearby, grateful for this respite from the confusing turmoil that had dominated her thoughts since the musicale 2 days earlier, when the Duke of Pembroke had spoken of his admiration in that small music room at Somerset House with an intensity that had both thrilled and terrified her. She had come seeking the comfort books had always provided, the escape into worlds built of stone and vision, rather than the treacherous landscape of hope and disappointment that her heart currently navigated, and she ran her fingers along the spines of volumes describing buildings she would likely never see, finding a strange solace in their permanence and clarity. The shop bell chimed, and Eleanor paid it no mind, too absorbed in examining a newly acquired folio on Venetian palaces to notice the stir of recognition that rippled through the other patrons. But when a familiar voice spoke her name with evident surprise, she looked up to find the Duke of Pembroke standing just 3 feet away with an expression that suggested he was as startled by the encounter as she was. "Miss Ashworth," he said again, and this time she heard genuine pleasure beneath the surprise. "I had not expected the gift of finding you here, though I suppose I should have guessed that a woman of your interests would frequent the finest bookshop in London." Eleanor felt her practiced defences rise automatically, the shield she had rebuilt after allowing it to lower too dangerously in recent weeks. But something in his face stopped the cool response she had prepared, a vulnerability in his dark eyes that made him look less like the powerful duke society saw and more like a man uncertain of his welcome. She managed a small curtsy and a quiet acknowledgement of his greeting, gesturing to the volume she held as explanation for her presence, and he moved closer to examine it with what appeared to be sincere interest rather than mere politeness, asking whether she had seen the illustrations of the Car d'Oro, and did she not think the Gothic arches there achieved something the later Renaissance buildings lost in their pursuit of classical symmetry. The conversation that followed flowed with the same natural ease their first exchange in the Westbrook Library had possessed, absent the pressure of watchful eyes and whispered speculation, and Eleanor found herself speaking freely about her thoughts on proportion and beauty, while he listened with attention that felt genuine and responded with observations that proved he had actually retained everything she had said during their previous conversations. When she mentioned wishing she could see the buildings she studied, rather than merely reading about them in books, he grew very quiet for a moment, before asking whether she had truly meant what she had said to him in the music room about doubting his sincerity. And Eleanor felt her breath catch at the direct question that cut through all social pretense. Before she could formulate a response, he continued speaking in a low voice meant only for her despite the public setting, saying he understood her skepticism given his failure to show consistent regard, but that he hoped she might allow him to prove through actions rather than words alone that his interest was neither charitable impulse nor passing amusement. And then he took the volume from her hands and carried it to the counter where he purchased it along with 2 other books on Italian architecture, before returning and presenting all 3 to her with a small bow and a reminder that she had been holding a book on Venetian palaces during their first conversation, and he had not forgotten a single detail of that evening. June 1st, 1817. The morning arrived at the Ashworth residence with the usual sounds of the household stirring to life. Servants moving quietly through the corridors, the distant clatter of breakfast preparations in the kitchen below, and Eleanor sat at her small writing desk by the window of her bedchamber, reviewing the careful notes she had been making about Gothic versus Renaissance principles of proportion, finding in the intellectual exercise a welcome distraction from the confusing hope that had taken root in her heart since the encounter at Hatchard's 5 days earlier, when the Duke of Pembroke had given her those books, with a look that suggested he meant them as something more than simple gifts. She had read the volumes each night by candlelight, discovering small marks in the margins where he had noted passages of particular interest, and she wondered whether he had purchased them already marked or if he had gone through them himself before presenting them to her. The latter possibility suggesting a degree of thoughtfulness that both thrilled and frightened her with its implications. A knock at her door announced Margaret, who entered with unusual animation in her expression, saying that a footman in the Duke's livery had just delivered a calling card, and Mother was currently in the morning room, having what appeared to be nervous palpitations, while insisting Eleanor must change her dress immediately and do something more becoming with her hair. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread as she followed her sister downstairs, finding their mother indeed in a state of agitation unusual even for a woman prone to dramatic responses, holding the elegant card as though it were a holy relic while explaining that the Duke of Pembroke requested permission to call that very afternoon at 3 o'clock, and surely this meant his intentions were serious, despite what society might whisper about Eleanor's age and circumstances. Margaret caught Eleanor's eye with a look of sympathy mixed with concern, her younger sister understanding better than anyone the dangerous territory of allowing hope to flourish when disappointment had been the constant companion of Eleanor's adult life. But there was no possibility of refusing the call without giving grave insult, and so Eleanor found herself 4 hours later dressed in her best afternoon gown of pale green muslin that Margaret insisted brought out the colour of her eyes. Seated in the formal parlour beside her mother, with hands folded carefully to conceal their trembling while they awaited the arrival that would either confirm the tentative hope growing in her heart or reveal it as the foolish fantasy Lady Catherine had named it. When the clock struck 3 and the butler announced the Duke of Pembroke, Eleanor felt time seem to slow as Alexander entered the room with perfect aristocratic bearing, bowing first to her mother with proper respect before turning his dark gaze to Eleanor with warmth that made her breath catch despite her determination to maintain composure. The call proceeded with flawless propriety as he discussed estate matters with her mother and inquired after the health of Margaret's husband, but his attention returned again and again to Eleanor. Drawing her into conversation about the books he had given her and listening to her observations with the focused attention she had come to recognize as distinctively his, and when he extended an invitation for the entire Ashworth family to attend a week-long house party at his country estate beginning on June 8th, Eleanor saw her mother's face transform with an expression of triumph mixed with disbelief, while Margaret reached over to squeeze her hand beneath the cover of her skirts in silent support. June 8th, 1817. The carriage bearing the Ashworth family turned off the main road onto the long private drive that wound through parkland more extensive and beautifully maintained than Eleanor had imagined possible, ancient oaks lining the approach like sentinels guarding the approach to a realm apart from ordinary existence. And when Pembroke Estate came into view at the crest of a gentle rise, her breath caught at the magnificence of the golden stone facade that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sunlight, with its perfectly proportioned windows and elegant classical portico that spoke of wealth so old and established it required no ostentation to announce itself. Her mother made a small sound of awe beside her, while Margaret squeezed her hand with an expression that mingled excitement and concern. Both sisters understanding that this week would either confirm the fragile hope that had been growing since the bookshop encounter and formal call, or shatter it completely in a setting where there would be no escape from the pain of disappointment. The carriage pulled up before the main entrance, where other vehicles were already discharging guests, and Eleanor recognized with a sinking sensation the elegant form of Lady Catherine Rushworth descending from a coach with her husband Lord Edmund, while casting an appraising look at the arriving families that suggested she was already cataloguing material for future gossip. Alexander stood at the top of the entrance steps, flanked by servants, looking every inch the Duke in command of his ancestral domain as he greeted each arriving guest with perfect aristocratic courtesy. And Eleanor felt her anxiety increase as she watched him bow over the hand of a beautiful young woman in a travelling dress of expensive silk, while her mother whispered that the girl must be Lady Harriet Somerset, whose family controlled half of Devonshire. When their turn came to be handed down from the carriage, Eleanor had armoured herself with the dignity that had sustained her through 11 seasons of being overlooked, prepared for the possibility that he would greet her with the same pleasant impersonality he had shown the other guests. But when his dark eyes met hers, something shifted in his expression, and he descended the steps himself, rather than allowing a footman to assist her, taking her hand with a warmth that seemed to communicate private meaning beneath the public gesture, while murmuring that he was most particularly glad to welcome her to his home. The tour of the principal rooms that followed revealed chambers of such elegance that Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the contrast to her own family's modest London residence. But Alexander remained near the Ashworth party throughout the procession, through staterooms and galleries, drawing Eleanor's attention to architectural details she might find interesting, and asking her opinion on the proportion of the Great Hall, with a deference that seemed to elevate her observations above those of guests with far greater social standing. When the housekeeper showed her to her assigned bedchamber, Eleanor discovered with wonder that the windows overlooked the rose garden she had glimpsed during the tour, the same garden where Alexander had spoken to her so intensely during the garden party at his London residence, and she could not believe the placement was accidental. That evening at dinner, she found herself seated not at the distant end of the table, where spinster relations were typically relegated, but rather in a position of honor near Alexander himself. And throughout the meal he engaged her in conversation with an attention that made several other guests exchange significant glances. While Lady Catherine's expression grew increasingly disapproving as she observed from across the table how the Duke ignored conventions of distributing his attention equally among guests, and instead focused his considerable charm on the most unlikely recipient present. June 9th, 1817. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room at Pembroke Estate, illuminating a chamber so elegantly appointed that Eleanor felt almost intimidated by the delicate porcelain and gleaming silver that adorned the sideboard. But Alexander rose immediately when she entered with her mother and Margaret, drawing out a chair for her personally, rather than allowing a footman to perform the service, and throughout the meal he consulted her opinion on matters related to the estate, with a seriousness that suggested he genuinely valued her perspective rather than merely making polite conversation to pass the time. Lady Catherine sat across the table with an expression growing increasingly sour as she observed how the Duke directed his attention so consistently toward the least socially significant guest present, and when Alexander proposed that Eleanor might enjoy seeing the greenhouse and its collection of exotic botanical specimens after breakfast, Lady Catherine's teacup clattered against its saucer with barely suppressed disapproval, while Margaret caught Eleanor's eye with a look of mingled excitement and concern. The walk through the formal gardens toward the greenhouse complex allowed Eleanor to appreciate the magnificence of the grounds with their precisely maintained parterres and elegant statuary. The June morning having turned warm with the promise of summer fully arrived, and when they entered the humid glass structure, with its soaring ceiling and lush vegetation that seemed transported from tropical realms, Alexander guided her past ordinary specimens toward a collection of rare orchids whose delicate blooms seemed impossibly beautiful in their intricate construction. Here, away from the observation of other guests, his manner relaxed further as he spoke of the years he had spent abroad in diplomatic service, the loneliness of a position that required constant performance of role with little opportunity for genuine connection, the death of his elder brother that had called him home to assume responsibilities he had never expected to inherit, and which often felt more burden than privilege. Eleanor found herself responding with her own experiences of invisibility within society, the way one could be surrounded by people yet feel entirely unseen. And when he reached past her to gesture toward a particularly unusual flower, his hand brushed against hers with a contact that seemed to carry current of warmth through her entire being. He did not immediately withdraw, but rather let his fingers rest against hers for a moment that stretched with significance, while his dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart accelerate, and she understood that something was shifting between them into territory both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. Through the glass walls of the greenhouse, Eleanor glimpsed Lady Catherine standing at a window of the main house, her figure rigid with what could only be disapproval, as she observed the Duke and the Spinster standing so close together among the exotic blooms, and Eleanor felt a chill of anxiety intrude upon the warmth of the moment, knowing that gossip was undoubtedly already circulating among the guests about the nature of Alexander's attentions and her own presumption in receiving them. June 10th, 1817. The afternoon sun blazed warm upon the south lawn of Pembroke Estate, where servants had erected an elegant white tent whose silk panels billowed gently in the summer breeze, and beneath its shade, tables had been arranged with refreshments for the garden party Alexander was hosting to introduce his house guests to the local gentry, a gathering that brought families from neighboring estates who were eager to see the Duke who had so recently taken up residence and to satisfy their curiosity about the guests he had chosen to honor with invitations to his home. Eleanor stood near the refreshment table wearing a sprigged muslin dress that Margaret had helped her select, feeling increasingly comfortable in a way that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier when she had been resigned to permanent invisibility, and she noticed with wonder, tinged with anxiety, how Alexander remained near her throughout the afternoon, bringing her glasses of lemonade, introducing her to neighboring families with a courtesy that elevated her importance rather than diminishing it, speaking of her observations on estate management and architectural history in a manner that suggested he valued her intellect and sought her counsel on matters of significance. The local families responded to his clear regard with a deference they would never have shown a spinster of 29 under ordinary circumstances, and Eleanor felt the strange, disorienting sensation of being seen and valued after so many years of being overlooked, though she remained conscious of the stares and whispered conversations that followed their movements around the lawn as guests tried to interpret the nature of the Duke's attentions. Lady Catherine observed these interactions with an expression of increasing disapproval from her position near the rose arbor, and when Alexander was temporarily drawn away by his steward regarding some household matter, she seized the opportunity to corner Eleanor near the edge of the tent where the crowd was thinner and their conversation less likely to be overheard by others. The words she spoke were delivered in a tone of false concern that barely concealed the cruelty beneath, as she remarked that it pained her to see an old acquaintance making such a spectacle of herself, that surely Eleanor must understand that the Duke was simply being kind to a guest, and that it would be foolish indeed for a woman of her age and limited prospects to mistake aristocratic politeness for genuine romantic interest, that the entire party was whispering about the pathetic spinster who had so badly misunderstood the situation and was setting herself up for humiliation when the Duke inevitably turned his attentions to a more suitable candidate for his affections. Eleanor felt the words strike like physical blows, each syllable finding the vulnerable places in her heart where doubt and fear still resided, despite the evidence of Alexander's regard. And though she maintained her composure through years of practice in enduring social cruelty, she could feel her hands trembling as she gripped her glass, while Lady Catherine continued her assault under the guise of friendly warning. Alexander returned to find Eleanor pale and shaken, Lady Catherine retreating with an expression of satisfaction, and something shifted in his demeanour as he took in the scene with the perceptiveness that came from years of diplomatic service reading underlying currents in social situations. And without a word to Eleanor, he strode after Lady Catherine with a determination that drew the attention of nearby guests. Those close enough to observe saw the Duke speak to Lady Catherine in tones too low to be overheard, but with an intensity that left no doubt he was delivering a rebuke. Saw her face flush with shock and anger. Saw him gesture toward Eleanor with a protectiveness that made his regard unmistakable, and within minutes the whispered story spread through the gathering that the Duke had confronted one of the most prominent ladies present on behalf of the spinster, that he had defended Miss Ashworth's honour, that his interest was clearly far more serious than anyone had imagined. June 11th, 1817. The morning mist still clung to the low places of the parkland surrounding Pembroke Estate, when Alexander sent word requesting Eleanor accompany him for a morning ride. And though she had never been particularly accomplished on horseback, she found herself accepting with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that had kept her awake much of the previous night, replaying the extraordinary scene of the Duke publicly defending her against Lady Catherine's cruelty. Margaret insisted Eleanor borrow her own dark green riding habit, which fit reasonably well despite needing adjustment at the waist, and as Eleanor descended to the stables she felt acutely conscious of how the borrowed garment represented her position as someone perpetually making do with what others could spare, rather than possessing the abundant resources that came naturally to those born to different circumstances. Alexander waited beside two horses already saddled, his own large black gelding and a gentler chestnut mare, whose calm temperament he had specifically requested for Eleanor's use, and he helped her mount with a steadying hand that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before swinging on to his own horse with the easy grace of someone raised to the saddle from childhood. They rode in companionable silence through the misty morning, following a track that led upward through wooded slopes toward higher ground, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the excuse not to speak immediately, as her mind churned with questions about his intentions and the meaning of yesterday's confrontation that had sent ripples of gossip through the entire party. The overlook he brought her to commanded a magnificent view across his lands. The estate house visible in the distance, with its elegant proportions, settled into the landscape like something that had grown there naturally over centuries, and when they dismounted, Alexander led the horses to graze, while he guided Eleanor to a fallen log that provided a natural seat overlooking the vista spread below them. He stood for a long moment, gazing across his property before turning to face her directly with an intensity in his dark eyes that made her heart accelerate with both hope and fear, and when he finally spoke, his words came carefully chosen, as though he had rehearsed them during the sleepless portions of his own night. He explained that when they first met, he had been captivated immediately by her intelligence and the dignity with which she carried herself despite society's dismissal, but having witnessed too many times how vicious gossip could destroy reputations and cause genuine suffering, he had initially maintained public distance while he examined his own heart, to be certain his interest was not merely passing attraction, but something deeper and more permanent. He admitted now that this strategy had been flawed, that in attempting to protect her from premature speculation, he had instead caused her pain and confusion, that watching Lady Catherine wound her yesterday had made him understand he could not guard his regard so carefully when she needed to know with certainty that he valued her beyond any other woman of his acquaintance. His voice grew rougher with emotion as he confessed that his feelings had grown far beyond his control, that he found himself thinking of her constantly, seeking her opinion, wanting to share every aspect of his life with someone whose mind and spirit matched his own in ways he had not imagined possible to find. Eleanor sat frozen as his words washed over her, scarcely daring to breathe lest she wake from what must surely be an impossible dream. But the morning sunlight breaking through the mist felt too real, and the vulnerability in his expression too genuine for fantasy. And when she finally found her voice to ask tremulously if he truly meant what he was saying, he knelt before her and took her hands in his with a tenderness that made tears spring to her eyes as he promised he would spend however long necessary proving his constancy until she could trust in the permanence of his devotion. June 12, 1817. The ballroom at Pembroke Estate blazed with the light of 500 candles, reflected in mirrors and crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across walls hung with silk in deep gold and cream, and the musicians Alexander had brought from London tuned their instruments on the dais, while guests assembled in their finest evening attire for what would prove to be the most significant social event of the house party, and perhaps of the entire season for those perceptive enough to understand what they were witnessing. Eleanor stood near the entrance, feeling her heart race with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as she smoothed the skirt of the gown Margaret had insisted she accept as a gift. A dress of pale ivory silk with delicate embroidery and silver thread that transformed her appearance in ways her usual modest attire never had, lending her a grace and elegance that several guests remarked upon as she entered, though she remained uncertain whether their compliments reflected genuine admiration or merely the social calculations inspired by Alexander's obvious regard. The assembled company included not only the house party guests, but also neighboring families invited specifically for the ball, creating an audience of perhaps 60 people whose attention focused immediately on Alexander as he moved to greet the final arrivals, and Eleanor felt the familiar instinct to retreat to the margins where she had spent so many years observing rather than participating. But before she could act on that impulse, Alexander crossed the room with unmistakable purpose and bowed before her, requesting the honor of the opening dance, with a formality that could not disguise the warmth in his eyes or the intimacy of his smile. The shock that rippled through the assembly was almost palpable as guests registered that the Duke was not merely showing courtesy to a guest, but claiming Eleanor publicly as his chosen partner for the most significant dance of the evening, a statement that carried implications no one could mistake, even if they wished to misinterpret his intentions. Eleanor felt her hand tremble slightly as she placed it in his, felt the reassuring pressure of his fingers as he led her to the center of the floor while the other guests formed sets around them. And when the music began and they moved through the figures of the dance, she found herself meeting his gaze directly rather than looking away, found courage in the steadiness of his attention and the unspoken promise conveyed through every touch and glance. The first dance ended to polite applause, but rather than releasing Eleanor to the customary rotation of partners, Alexander remained near her as the next set formed, engaging her in quiet conversation that excluded the world around them until the music began again, and he claimed her for a second dance, a breach of propriety so blatant that even those inclined to excuse his behavior as eccentricity could not ignore its significance. Lady Catherine watched from her position near the refreshment table with an expression that shifted from disapproval to active hostility as she observed not only the Duke's unprecedented attention, but the way other gentlemen began approaching Eleanor between dances, following Alexander's lead in treating her as a woman of consequence rather than a negligible spinster. And when Alexander claimed Eleanor for a third dance, the whispers crescendoed into open speculation about whether an engagement would be announced before the party concluded. Lord Richard Sinclair, observing Lady Catherine begin to circulate among the guests with clear intention to spread poison, intercepted her conversation with the Tremaines and spoke in carrying tones about how Miss Ashworth had been instrumental in helping Alexander plan charitable initiatives for the estate tenants, revealing an involvement in the Duke's affairs that suggested intimacy and trust beyond mere social acquaintance, lending Eleanor a legitimacy and value that even the most determined gossips found difficult to dismiss entirely. June 13th, 1817. The morning sun streamed through tall windows into the small private breakfast room where Alexander had arranged for Eleanor to join him alone, save for the discreet presence of a maid stationed near the door to satisfy propriety. And as Eleanor entered, still feeling as though she moved through some impossible dream after the previous evening's extraordinary ball, she found him standing by the window, gazing out at the gardens with an expression that shifted to unmistakable warmth when he turned at the sound of her entrance and crossed to pull out her chair himself, rather than allowing the servant to perform that office. The breakfast laid out was more intimate than the grand buffet offered to other guests in the main dining room, with delicate pastries and fresh fruit arranged on china, so fine Eleanor could see light through it, and as Alexander dismissed the maid to wait outside the closed door, Eleanor felt her heart accelerate with the significance of this private audience that suggested intentions serious enough to disregard the whispers such arrangements would inevitably inspire among the remaining house guests. He did not speak immediately, but instead served her himself, placing selections on her plate with careful attention to what he had observed she preferred during previous meals. And this small gesture of having noticed her tastes moved Eleanor more than grander displays might have done, because it revealed the depth of his attention to details about her that most people never bothered to observe. When he finally spoke, after taking the seat beside rather than across from her, his voice carried a seriousness that made her set down her fork and give him her complete attention as he began to speak of how her life might change, asking with genuine interest about dreams she had harbored beyond society's narrow expectations for women of her station, and particularly for those dismissed as past the age for new beginnings. Eleanor found herself speaking more freely than she had ever dared about her longing to see the world beyond England's shores, to stand before the architecture she had studied in books, and understand how light and proportion combined to create beauty, to live a life defined by curiosity and growth rather than the slow diminishment into invisibility that society prescribed for spinsters. And as she spoke, she watched his expression grow more animated with each word, as though her dreams aligned perfectly with visions he had been harboring himself. Alexander leaned forward and took her hand where it rested on the table, his touch gentle but definite, and told her he wanted to show her Italy and the architectural wonders she had studied, that he had connections in Florence and Rome who could provide access to buildings rarely opened to visitors, that traveling with someone who shared his appreciation for art and history would transform experiences he had previously undertaken alone into something infinitely richer. His words painted a future so vivid Eleanor could almost see the Italian sunlight and smell the flowers that must grow in Mediterranean gardens, and she felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity of someone not only accepting her dreams, but actively wishing to facilitate their fulfillment in ways her limited circumstances had never allowed her to imagine possible. He opened his mouth to continue speaking, his expression suggesting he was building toward something of great significance, when a sharp knock at the door interrupted, and his steward entered with profuse apologies, carrying a letter whose seal Alexander recognized immediately with the expression of frustration that told Eleanor this communication could not be ignored, despite his clear wish to do exactly that. He read quickly, his jaw tightening, then looked at Eleanor with genuine regret as he explained that urgent business regarding tenant disputes on the northern portion of his estate required his immediate attention and consultation with his land agent, matters that could not be postponed without risking real harm to families depending on his intervention. Eleanor assured him she understood, even as disappointment settled heavy in her chest at whatever he had been about to say before this interruption. And though Alexander retained her hand a moment longer and promised they would continue this conversation very soon, she felt the weight of words unspoken hanging between them as he reluctantly rose to attend to his duties, leaving her alone with cold breakfast and a heart suspended between hope and uncertainty. June 14th, 1817. The afternoon carried a quality of ending as guests assembled in the entrance hall with trunks and cases being loaded onto carriages, while servants moved efficiently through rooms restoring order to spaces that had hosted a week of extraordinary social theatre. And Eleanor stood near the window of her assigned bedchamber, looking out at the rose garden one final time, feeling her chest tighten with the anxiety of departure and separation from Alexander, who had spent the morning sequestered with his land agent, addressing the crisis revealed in yesterday's letter, while she had been forced to pack and prepare for the return journey to London, without the private conversation she desperately wished to complete. The other guests departed in clusters, with Lady Catherine offering Eleanor a look of such complex mixture of defeat and lingering malice that Eleanor understood her former friend had recognized the shift in social dynamics, even if she refused to accept it gracefully. And Margaret touched Eleanor's arm gently as they waited for their own carriage to be brought round. Her sister's expression combining genuine happiness for Eleanor's prospects with concern about the uncertainty of a courtship, interrupted at such a crucial moment. Alexander emerged from his study looking tired and frustrated as the Ashworth family prepared to enter their carriage, and he approached Eleanor directly with less concern for propriety than he might have shown a week earlier, requesting a private word that her mother granted with barely concealed eagerness, despite the impropriety of such a request, in view of departing guests and household staff. He drew her aside to the small morning room where they had breakfasted the previous day, and took both her hands in his with an urgency that sent her heart racing as he apologized for the estate matters that demanded his continued presence here for at least another week, explaining that tenant families faced genuine hardship that he could not in good conscience ignore, even though every instinct urged him to abandon duty and follow her to London immediately. Eleanor assured him she understood, that his care for those depending on him was among the qualities she most admired. But her voice trembled slightly with the fear that separation might somehow break the spell of these past days and return her to the invisibility she had known before his attention transformed her social existence. Alexander seemed to hear the fear beneath her words, because he lifted one hand to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made tears prick her eyes, and he promised in a voice rough with emotion that he would call on her in London the moment his business concluded, that she should reserve the afternoons of the 21st and 22nd for him, specifically because he had particular plans that required her exclusive company. He released her hands reluctantly to retrieve a package from the desk, presenting her with a leather-bound volume she recognized immediately as an expensive edition of Italian architectural studies. And when she opened it, she discovered he had filled the margins with handwritten notes throughout, observations and questions clearly meant to continue their conversations across the distance and days that would separate them, a gift that demonstrated both the depth of his attention and his intention to maintain their connection despite physical separation. Their farewell in view of her waiting family was necessarily brief, but the pressure of his hands and the intensity of his gaze communicated promises that required no words, and as the carriage rolled down the drive, carrying her away from Pembroke Estate, Eleanor clutched the book to her chest and allowed herself to hope that the courtship so dramatically begun would continue to its natural conclusion despite this temporary parting. Though a small voice of old fear whispered that a week apart might give Alexander time to reconsider the wisdom of attaching himself to a woman society had long since dismissed as past the age for such romantic possibilities. June 21st, 1817. The week since Eleanor's return to London had passed with excruciating slowness, each day bringing a fresh torment of social attention that ranged from genuine curiosity to thinly veiled cruelty, as word of the Duke's marked preference during the country house party spread through drawing rooms and ballrooms like fire through dry grass, and Eleanor found herself subjected to scrutiny more intense than any she had endured during 11 previous seasons, when she had at least enjoyed the mercy of invisibility rather than this new experience of being observed and discussed and speculated upon by people who had never bothered to learn her name before Alexander Pembroke had shown her such unmistakable regard. Margaret stayed close during calling hours, offering silent support while their mother vacillated between unprecedented pride in her eldest daughter's prospects and anxiety that something might yet destroy this impossible good fortune. And Eleanor herself moved through the days in a state of suspended animation, counting hours until the 21st, when Alexander had promised to call, clinging to the Italian architecture book with his handwritten notes as proof that the extraordinary events at Pembroke Estate had actually occurred and were not some fever dream conjured by a spinster's desperate imagination. The afternoon of the 21st arrived at last, and Eleanor dressed with trembling hands in a gown of pale green muslin that Margaret insisted brought out the colour of her eyes, and when Alexander's card was brought up precisely at 3 o'clock, her heart hammered so violently she feared the other callers already assembled in the drawing-room must surely hear it. But she arranged her features into composure and rose with as much dignity as she could summon when he entered the room, bringing with him a presence that seemed to charge the very air and draw every eye to his tall figure as he greeted her mother with perfect courtesy, before turning to Eleanor with a warmth in his grey eyes that made her breath catch. The drawing-room was unfortunately full of other callers, as was typical during fashionable calling hours, including Mrs. Weatherby and her daughters, who had never deigned to acknowledge Eleanor before, but now watched with avid interest, and Lord and Lady Hastings, who had arrived moments before Alexander, and whose expressions combined surprise and something less pleasant as they observed the Duke's particular attention to Eleanor as he took the seat beside her and began inquiring about her week with the ease of established intimacy that suggested rights no unmarried gentleman should presume. Lord Hastings, a portly man of 50 with a reputation for cruel wit and an inflated sense of his own importance, due to family connections to an earl, exchanged a glance with his wife, before remarking in a voice pitched to carry across the drawing-room that it was remarkable how certain spinsters who had long accepted their inevitable fate could develop such inflated expectations based on simple kindness, from gentlemen too well bred to show the disdain such presumption deserved. And the room fell into immediate shocked silence as every person present understood the insult directed at Eleanor and waited to see how the Duke would respond to this challenge to his judgment and her character. Alexander rose slowly from his seat, his movement controlled but carrying such cold fury that Lord Hastings actually drew back slightly as the Duke crossed the few steps to stand directly before him, and in a voice of ice Alexander stated that he required Lord Hastings to immediately retract his statement and offer Miss Ashworth a sincere apology. And when Hastings attempted to bluster that he had made no specific accusation, Alexander cut him off with a gesture and stated in tones that brooked no argument that any insult to Miss Ashworth was an insult to himself personally, and that Hastings would either apologize and depart immediately or face social consequences that would make his current standing in society seem a fond memory. and the absolute authority in Alexander's voice, combined with the clear threat, left no room for defiance. Lord Hastings, his face mottled red with humiliation, offered a stilted apology to Eleanor before practically fleeing the drawing room with his wife hurrying after him, and Alexander turned to the remaining callers and stated clearly that Miss Ashworth was under his protection, and that he would view any further discourtesy toward her as a personal affront requiring his direct response, a declaration that left no doubt about his intentions and sent a clear message through London society that Eleanor had transformed from overlooked spinster to a woman claiming the interest and defence of one of England's most powerful men. June 23rd, 1817. The invitation to accompany the Ashworth family to the opera in his private box had arrived that morning, written in Alexander's own hand, rather than through a secretary. And Eleanor had read the brief lines so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases, while her mother had immediately begun fretting over what gown would be appropriate for such a conspicuous public appearance in the company of a duke, whose intentions had become the primary topic of speculation throughout London society since his dramatic defence of Eleanor during calling hours 2 days prior. Margaret had lent Eleanor a shawl of delicate silk in deep ivory that complemented the rose-coloured gown Eleanor had chosen, and when Alexander arrived at their townhouse precisely at 7 o'clock to escort them personally, rather than simply meeting them at the theatre, Eleanor's mother had practically trembled with the significance of such marked attention, while Margaret squeezed Eleanor's hand with sisterly encouragement, and Eleanor herself felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Alexander greeted her with warmth that seemed to light his usually reserved features from within. The journey to the theatre passed in a blur of nervous awareness of Alexander seated across from her in the carriage, making gracious conversation with her mother, while his eyes kept returning to Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin warm and her breath catch. And when they arrived at the grand entrance where fashionable society gathered to see and be seen, Alexander handed Eleanor down from the carriage himself and kept her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm as they entered the building, a gesture of possession and protection that sent whispers rippling through the crowd like wind across water. His private box occupied a prime position with excellent views of both stage and audience, and Alexander seated Eleanor in the place of honour beside him rather than relegating her to a rear position as propriety might suggest for an unmarried woman not yet formally betrothed. And throughout the first act of the performance he leaned close to make quiet observations about the singers and orchestra that created an intimate bubble of shared attention, despite the hundreds of eyes Eleanor could feel upon them from other boxes and the pit below. During the interval when society members traditionally visited each other's boxes to gossip and network, several acquaintances came to pay respects to the Duke and were introduced to the Ashworth family, with a courtesy that elevated their social standing simply through association. But Eleanor also heard the whispered speculation from the adjacent box, where Sir Thomas Waverley remarked to his companion, in a voice pitched to carry, that it was surprising to see a man of the Duke's standing forming an attachment to a woman so clearly past the first bloom of youth, questioning what could possibly have prompted such an unlikely match when younger and prettier girls had vied for his attention all season. Alexander stiffened beside Eleanor, and she felt him turn deliberately to face Sir Thomas across the divide between boxes, and in a voice clear and firm enough that nearby boxes fell silent to listen, Alexander stated that he had never in his life met a woman of greater worth than Miss Ashworth, that her intelligence and character far surpassed any superficial attributes society prized in younger women, and that only a fool would measure value by age when wisdom and depth of spirit mattered infinitely more than the arbitrary limitations society imposed on women who had the misfortune to possess genuine substance rather than mere decorative appeal. The silence that followed this pronouncement seemed to pulse with shock, and then Alexander reached across the small space between their seats and took Eleanor's gloved hand in his own, holding it openly where anyone might observe, a gesture of public claim that declared his intentions more clearly than any formal announcement could have done, while Eleanor sat frozen in wonder that this extraordinary man had not only defended her worth, but had done so in language that dismantled the very foundations of society's cruelty toward women like herself, who had been deemed unworthy simply for surviving past an age deemed suitable for marriage and romance. June 25th, 1817. The invitation had arrived the morning after the opera in Alexander's own distinctive hand, requesting Eleanor's presence for a private breakfast in the garden of his London residence. And though the note specified that Mrs. Ashworth would, of course, be welcome to provide proper chaperonage, something in the formal phrasing combined with the intimate setting suggested a significance that made Eleanor's hands tremble as she dressed in a gown of soft cream muslin with Margaret's help, her sister's knowing smile and gentle squeeze of encouragement confirming that they both understood this morning might change everything. The journey to Pembroke House passed in a haze of nervous anticipation, with her mother offering an endless stream of advice about proper deportment that Eleanor barely heard over the thundering of her own heart. And when they arrived at the imposing townhouse with its elegant Georgian facade, Alexander himself came to greet them in the entrance hall, looking somehow both perfectly composed and subtly anxious in a way that made Eleanor's breath catch, because she had never seen him anything less than completely self-assured. He escorted them through the house to the private garden behind where a small table had been arranged in a secluded corner, surrounded by climbing roses just beginning their summer bloom. And though Eleanor's mother was seated at a respectful distance on a bench with tea and refreshments of her own, where she could observe propriety while offering the illusion of privacy, Eleanor felt as though she and Alexander existed in a world containing only the two of them, as he handed her into her chair, with a touch that lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. The breakfast laid before them was exquisite, but Eleanor could barely taste the delicate pastries and fresh fruit as Alexander made gentle conversation about inconsequential matters, while the morning light filtered through the leaves overhead and painted shifting patterns across the white linen tablecloth. And then he set down his cup with deliberate care and turned to face her fully, his grey eyes holding an intensity that made her forget to breathe, as he began to speak in a voice low and earnest about how their acquaintance had transformed from that first evening in the Westbrook Library, when he had recognized in her a kindred spirit whose intelligence and depth of character had drawn him like a beacon in the shallow waters of society. He spoke of how her dignity in the face of dismissal had taught him the true meaning of courage, how her observations about art and architecture and human nature had challenged his assumptions and expanded his understanding, how her very presence had illuminated the arbitrary cruelty of social limitations he had never questioned until seeing them through her eyes. And Eleanor felt tears gathering as he reached across the small table to take her hand in both of his, and stated with absolute conviction that she had shown him what genuine worth looked like, and that he could not imagine facing his future without her wisdom and grace and remarkable spirit beside him. He released her hand only to reach into his coat and withdraw a small velvet box, which he opened to reveal a ring of breathtaking simplicity, a single perfect sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the morning light and scattered it in blue fire, and he explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had defied her own family's expectations to marry his grandfather for love rather than strategic alliance, and who had told him before she died that he should give this ring only to a woman who understood that true value lay in character rather than circumstance. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "would you grant me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to spend my life proving myself worthy of the gift of your partnership, of traveling with me to see the architecture of Italy you have studied in books, and building a future where we might face whatever comes with the strength we have found in one another? The yes that escaped Eleanor's lips was half laugh and half sob, as joy unlike anything she had ever known flooded through her, and when Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit as perfectly as if it had been made for her alone. And then he was rising and drawing her to her feet and asking with endearing uncertainty if he might kiss her. And Eleanor nodded through her tears as his hands came up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. And his lips met hers in a kiss that was both achingly tender and full of promise, sealing between them a commitment that transcended every limitation society had tried to impose, and proving that love recognized no boundaries save those of the heart itself. July 15th, 1817. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned with golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Ashworth townhouse where she had awakened for the last time as an unmarried woman. And as Margaret helped her dress in the elegant gown of ivory silk that had been crafted by London's finest modiste, Eleanor caught sight of her own reflection in the looking-glass and barely recognized the radiant woman who gazed back at her, transformed not by cosmetics or elaborate styling, but by the unmistakable glow of genuine happiness that seemed to illuminate her from within in a way that 29 years of invisibility had never permitted. The Church of St. George in Hanover Square was filled to capacity when their carriage arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she glimpsed through the open doors the rows of fashionable society members who had come to witness the marriage of the Duke of Pembroke to the woman many of them had dismissed as a hopeless spinster only 2 months prior. Their presence now a testament to how completely the social winds had shifted once Alexander had made his regard unmistakably clear. Margaret preceded her down the aisle in a gown of pale rose, Eleanor's only attendant, and Eleanor's mother wept openly in the front pew beside Margaret's husband, while on the opposite side Lord Richard Sinclair stood beside Alexander at the altar, and when Eleanor's eyes found Alexander's as she began her slow processional walk on her father's arm, the expression of wonder and love and absolute certainty on his face made every moment of doubt and pain from her past dissolve like morning mist under the sun. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn vows that Eleanor spoke with a steady voice that surprised her, given how her heart raced. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander lifted her veil to kiss her with tender reverence before the assembled congregation, Eleanor heard the rustle of whispers and knew that many present were remarking on the genuine affection so evident between the couple, so different from the strategic alliances that typically characterized aristocratic marriages. The wedding breakfast held at Pembroke House afterward seemed to Eleanor like moving through a dream, where former critics now competed to offer congratulations and claim they had always recognized her worthiness. And though Eleanor noted with a mixture of relief and vindication that Lady Catherine Rushworth had declined the invitation and was conspicuously absent, she found she could summon no bitterness toward her former friend, because the happiness she had found rendered past cruelties powerless to wound her. When Alexander rose to offer a toast to his new bride, his words were simple but devastating in their sincerity, as he thanked Eleanor for teaching him that true worth had nothing to do with age or social standing, and everything to do with the depth of character and generosity of spirit she possessed in such abundance. And when they shared their first dance as husband and wife while the assembled guests looked on, Eleanor felt Alexander's arms around her, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just love, but genuine partnership with a man who truly saw her and valued her for exactly who she was, and that this beginning they had fought so hard to claim together was only the first chapter of a story that would continue to unfold in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Spring had come to Florence in the year 1819, and Eleanor Pembroke stood on the terrace of the villa overlooking the ancient city, with one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where her first child grew, and the other holding a sheet of sketching paper, upon which she had been attempting to capture the soaring dome of the cathedral that dominated the skyline, though she found herself distracted by the sheer impossibility of believing that this life was truly hers. That the woman who had once stood invisible at the edges of London ballrooms now spent her days surrounded by the Italian architecture she had studied in books, and her nights in the arms of a man who looked at her as though she held the secrets of the universe. Alexander sat nearby in the dappled shade of a lemon tree, reading from a volume of poetry, but glancing up frequently to watch his wife with an expression of such contentment that it still made Eleanor's heart catch even after 2 years of marriage. And when he noticed her attention had drifted from her sketching, he set aside his book and came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist and his chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out together over the terracotta roofs and winding streets of the city that had welcomed them like a promise fulfilled. A letter had arrived that morning from Margaret, describing how her 3 children filled their country home with joyful chaos and how their mother had become insufferable in her tendency to work Eleanor's title as Duchess into every conversation with the neighbours, and there had been a separate note from Richard Sinclair mentioning with obvious amusement that even Lady Catherine Rushworth had been heard to speak approvingly of the match at a recent gathering, time and the undeniable evidence of genuine happiness having softened even her bitter judgment. Eleanor leaned back into her husband's embrace and reflected aloud on how strange it was that being truly seen by one person who valued her for exactly who she was had changed not just her circumstances but her very understanding of herself, had given her permission to step fully into a life she had never dared to imagine possible. And Alexander tightened his arms around her and replied that she had done the same for him, that her courage in maintaining her dignity despite society's cruelty had taught him what real strength looked like and given him the determination to defy conventions that suddenly seemed not just arbitrary but actively cruel in their limitations. They stood together as the afternoon light turned golden and painted the ancient stones of Florence in warm amber, and Eleanor thought of the girl she had been at 29, standing at the edge of a ballroom in an outdated gown, believing her life was already over, and she wished she could reach back through time to whisper to that lonely, invisible woman that the story was not finished, that sometimes the most extraordinary chapters begin precisely when we have stopped expecting them, that true worth exists independent of society's recognition, but being genuinely seen by another soul who values that worth transforms everything in ways both profound and lasting. And perhaps you who are listening to this story now find yourself in a season of waiting or invisibility. Perhaps you have been told by circumstance or cruel voices that your time has passed, or that you are somehow less than enough. And if that is so, then please hear this truth that Eleanor and Alexander discovered together in their defiance of limitations others tried to impose, that it is never too late for new beginnings. That authentic connection transcends every arbitrary boundary society constructs, and that your worth has always existed waiting only for the courage to claim it, and perhaps for one other person with wisdom enough to recognize it and celebrate it as the gift it truly is.